Hey everyone, Steve here, and in this video I'll be unboxing and giving my thoughts on the BrawlerGen controller from Retro Fighters that works both on Sega Saturn and Sega Mega Drive, or Genesis if you're from America, and I tried this controller out on the Dreamcast as well with the help of an adapter. Now the company Retro Fighters make a bunch of controllers for retro consoles. Some of these include the Brawler 64 for the Nintendo 64 and the Striker DC for the Dreamcast, so you may have heard of them before. The box that it comes in, I would say, is decent quality. There's a nice look to it, and inside you do get a free keychain of this, I guess, Brawler character, which is kind of cool. Now I think the main draw of this controller is that it has both Genesis and Saturn plugs that must auto-detect what system you're playing on and is natively compatible with both. The controller layout itself seems to be based on the Genesis 6-button controller, where it's got kind of flat buttons on the bottom and rounded, almost spherical buttons on the top row. One of the key additions though that we can see here is an analog style stick. I don't say an analog stick for reasons that we'll see later, but it does have the original rocker style D-pad of both controllers, and it's also got added bumpers for Saturn functionality, which don't feel like original Saturn controller bumpers. What I'm most interested in is the actual Saturn functionality, because I just like the Saturn console more, and there are a lot of Genesis controllers around, so that's not something that I'm as interested in. But in general, the controller feels really nice, and you can see it's kind of got those modern style grips instead of the Saturn/Genesis style, I guess you would say, like oval shape. So yeah, it is a nice modern style controller for all these old consoles. Now, before I tested it out on the Saturn itself, I thought it might be easiest to see how the controller behaves when I plug it into USB adapters. So I have two here. I've got an adapter from RAFnet and an adapter from Mayflash, and it turns out that neither of those adapters would recognize the controller, and it just basically doesn't work at all. So I thought initially this might mean the controller itself is faulty, but I quickly moved on to testing it on the real console. But just for reference, when you plug in a real Saturn 3D controller into both of these adapters, you have both an analog stick and analog triggers recognized for use on your PC. For good measure, I also decided to test the Mega Drive cable using the Mayflash Mega Drive to switch/USB adapter, and that combination does work, but the analog stick gets mapped as a D-pad and the bumpers don't do anything. So I made a video before where I tried to see if the analog sticks on PS4 controllers, when adapted to Sega Saturn via like the Retrobit adapter or the Brook adapter, acted as 3D analog Saturn pads. And to do that, I used the game Manx TT Superbike, or Manx Superbike TT. And in that game, it has a nice functionality where you can basically see what controller you've got plugged in and whether or not you'll have analog steering and acceleration. So trying out the BrawlerGen on that game, you can clearly see that it basically acts as a normal Saturn pad with just a D-pad and no analog functionality whatsoever, which is kind of a letdown because I guess 3D controller pads aren't as common as normal Saturn pads. So you think that this might have been a good substitute for that, but I guess they just weren't able to figure out how to encode the analog stick as such. So that was basically all I needed to know in terms of the Saturn functionality of the BrawlerGen. So after that, I basically wanted to see if I could make this controller look a bit more interesting. So I decided to take out a Japanese Saturn pad that I had spare and see if at least the ABC buttons could be swapped and I could have a more interesting looking BrawlerGen to have in the collection. But basically this didn't turn out well because the buttons aren't keyed the same, meaning the little plastic tabs and notches that they use to make sure you put in the button right aren't the same between the two controllers, because they really wouldn't be. I don't see why. So I thought I could just use some flash cutters and cut off the tabs to make it work, but the buttons themselves in the normal Saturn pad are much shorter than the ones in the BrawlerGen, so it kind of was a fail on two accounts. But at least I could still put the buttons back in the Japanese Saturn controller, so it didn't go to waste there. But in taking the BrawlerGen apart, I did encounter something interesting in that I broke basically both cables connecting the bumper buttons to the main board. So they sit on these two little, I guess, daughter boards that sit in the shoulder of the controller. A lot of controllers are built the same way. And the cables connecting these boards are quite fragile. They only have a tiny contact point, and through my moving around trying to do the button mod, I basically ripped both of them. I only ripped a little bit at the start, but then trying to fix that one, I ended up ripping both. So I thought, why don't I just try and resolder these with a bit more solder to kind of create a stronger connection? So I tried to do this using the same cables that it came with, but again, these cables were so weak and really thin gauge wire that I just had to stop and use wire of my own. Luckily, I had some spare cable laying around, so I just had to do my own makeshift repair here. And the quality of the PCB, or maybe it was just the way I handled it, wasn't actually that great either, because I ended up kind of tearing up the pads on one of the daughter boards, and I had to scrape away the solder mask and everything like that and do my first solder to trace, which wasn't actually that bad as long as I had flux and I could get everything to adhere properly. So I got the controller back together and everything like that, but it does kind of speak to the quality, and I guess that you shouldn't really be messing around with this controller because there's nothing much to do with it anyways. The bumper that I had to solder to trace on is now a little squishy because I think I've added too much solder and the membrane kind of lifts up a little bit, but that's fine. And I also managed to touch the analog stick with my soldering iron for a split second and created a little melt, but I can live with that. As I said at the start of the video, I also tested this out on the Dreamcast using an adapter. I used the Total Control 3, though I have a bunch of other Saturn to Dreamcast adapters, and the controller works fine. Again, I would imagine that it's not like you now have a Dreamcast analog stick, so only games that use the D-pad will be like playable, I suppose. But yeah, of course, you know, they've got the free MVC2 movement going on right now, so I decided to test it on Marvel vs. Capcom 2, and it works perfectly fine. No issues connecting or recognizing the inputs at all. Input lag, I'm not really sure about. I'm sure it's more down to the adapter in this case, and couldn't notice any. So those are basically my thoughts on the BrawlerGen by Retro Fighters. If you liked the video, a subscribe and a thumbs up would be great, and there's a whole lot more to see on my channel, so I hope you stick around. Thanks for watching, see ya.